brave the cold. I almost didn't come, and it's just across the street. Stick it out. But thank you for coming. And let's begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving and good God, we give you thanks and praise for all of your many gifts to us. The gift of your Son, our Lord Jesus, who shows us your love. The gift of your Spirit, who moves in our hearts and in our lives. The gift of faith. The gift of community. The gift of your call to follow after you. We ask your blessings upon us this night, that as we learn of those who have gone before us, as we seek to follow after them, that we may draw closer to you and to each other. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, I've already had it pointed out that I can't spell. I didn't notice that at all. I did not notice that at all. That is a complete and total typo. And I don't understand why it didn't get underlined in red like they but it didn't. So if last week you found out that I had made a mistake about the Four Clares, tonight you found out that I made a mistake about spelling. So that's, you now know I am truly fallible. I am truly fallible.
Human.
And human. So we're talking about the study of history, which is a conversation that we're trying to engage with people who have been to some place we could never be, the past. They've gone, they've been there, and we're listening for their voices, though we have something to say as well. That's why it's a conversation, that we take in what they have to say, but then we bring ourselves and our experience and what we have learned in the time since they lived, so that we're not dictated to by the past, but we can be informed, we can be helped, we can learn from the past. And in this case, we started with the missions. We started with the missions, and if you'll remember, 1493, when the Franciscans came on Columbus's second voyage, because they wanted to make sure he could get home on the first one. When they came to Florida in 1521 and to New Mexico in 1539, where did they come in 1598? Oh, to New Mexico to stay in 1598, and then in the 1850s, when they started coming to what is now the United States in groups from Europe. So it wasn't the United States yet for all of these, but then when we get to the 1850s, it's the United States. When they came as missionaries, they came to be with the people and to share with the people, to engage in a conversation with them. And that means if you wish to be heard, first you must listen. So they listened and learned languages, they learned architecture, they did all of those things as missionaries, because they were intent on sharing the gospel in the best way that they possibly could. And so that's why, the missionaries came, that they came to learn the language, or to share prayer with the language of the heart. That's the language of the lullaby. So that and the architecture, the kiva and the convento in New Mexico, that you bring together the cultures as well as the message. When they came, this is all before the 1850s. But then in the 1850s and beyond that, we see the waves of immigration that we talked about last week. That those waves of immigration, the Canadians say the First Nations, which I think is probably more accurate than saying Native Americans, to say First Nations, because they were the First Nations. They came more than 10,000 years ago to this continent. And then starting in the 16th century with Hispanics and Latino Americanos, the British, the enslaved Africans, the French, all of these groups start coming and leaving at different times, but they all start coming. It's like the waves are kind of bumps of immigration, because they all run into the ones who were here before them. So that's happening. Then in the 1850s, as we talk about it, we said that that we had groups. Who's the shamrock again? And who's the blue triangle? And the yellow diamond?
Polish.
Well, Norwegians are in there, but it was mostly Polish. Polish, and then a pizza pie. Who would it be? A pizza pie. Italian. And so you see on the map where people were in large groups, and then the friars, each one of the little circles with a cross, that's a little Franciscan habit for a provincial headquarters that ended up in that spot, in that place, as they began across in the 19th century. And then, of course, this is Santa Barbara, which you may remember, that's my center point of the hourglass, because the hourglass begins with the top-down missionaries of the Spanish and the French crowns, but the sand all runs out, and it runs out remaining only in one place since colonial times without interruption, and that's Santa Barbara. And so in the 1850s, the immigrants start coming on the bottom, building up, and the hourglass turns over, and the story starts again. So that's basically what was going on up to the 19th century. And now I want to fit that for a moment. I want to fit that together with what was happening in the rest of the world, and most especially what was happening among Franciscan men. In the U.S., if you look at 1825, you can barely see a little line here. It's because there are 56 Franciscan men in the United States in 1825. Most of them in California, a few in Texas still, not many, but a few, and then the 6 Capuchins are in Louisiana. They're around New Orleans. So you've got 50 observants, 6 Capuchins, 56 total in 1825. By 1936, look what's happened to the number of friars in the United States. In 1936, there were 1,938 observant friars. There were 445 Capuchins, 736 conventuals, a total of 3,219 friars in 1936. They had increased by 5,748% in that period. At the same time, even though this is a small, very small part of the world picture, because this is at the same scale. So this is the United States in 1936, 1825. This is the world in the 1680s, the 1770s, and the 1880s. It's hard to get figures, it's really hard to get figures to correspond exactly with the dates, because different people counted people at different times. So that's why this comes out strangely. But look what happens. In the 1680s, there are 60,000 observant friars. There are 20,000 of the, 21,000 Capuchins, and 15,000 observant friars. Then after the 1680s, they keep growing. I mean, this is worldwide. So this is primarily Europe and Latin America, with a little bit of Africa, a little bit of Asia thrown in. But not anybody in the United States except for those few observants who were here, both in New France and in New Mexico, in New Mexico, not California yet, but New Mexico and not Texas yet. It's New Mexico and Florida. Then they keep growing, and the peak, the worldwide peak, is in the 1870s, or 1770s, excuse me. We reached a point where there were 135,000 Franciscan men in the world in the 1770s. by 1880s, that number has dropped to 33,500.
Wow.
So in other words, it has dropped from the peak in the 1770s to the bottom of the trough in the 1880s. It's dropped by about 75%. It's dropped by about 75%. There's a whole lot of stuff that's going on in that time. You have the Enlightenment, which is this whole intellectual movement in Europe that many people see as the beginning of secularization of the world. It's the beginning of saying we really don't need God. That's kind of what the Enlightenment says. It didn't go quite that far, but it came close. It says we don't need God, we can handle things, and political turmoil and all kinds of stuff. The French Revolution, just about, you can see what happens. You can see what happens to the conventuals. They drop from 25,000 in 1770, many of whom were in France. They dropped to only 1,400 in the 1880s. They almost disappeared. So that they've come back a bit, but they almost disappeared then. So this is what's happening in the world. With all of that happening in the world, with all of those changes, and you get Napoleon in there, the French Revolution, you get the revolutions in Europe in the 1840s, you get the Risorgimento, and you get all of those things, the Kulturkampf that comes in the 1870s in Germany, all of those things happening. It looks like, and it's very much felt like, by the people, and especially the Franciscans in the United States, that here is the hope for the world. We're someplace where we're growing, while every place else is shrinking. Every place else it's shrinking, it seems to be dying away, the Franciscan movement of men. And so we're growing, they're dying. We have something that we're going to share from here in the United States. We are going to go to the whole world and make disciples. But the question is going to become, and this, by the way, this is a banner at St. Francis Solano in Quincy. That's of Francis Solano going and making disciples in the whole world. He was a missionary. This mission spirit that was going on in the late 19th century into the 20th century. But what are they really going to be? What kind of missionaries are they going to be? Remember I said that the Spanish sent missionaries to make not only Christians out of the natives they encountered, but to make Spaniards out of them. The Spanish government wanted the friars to teach the Spanish language. They wanted the friars to teach them Spanish customs. They wanted the friars to teach them to pay Spanish taxes in the empire. All of that was going on. And that is just about always and inevitable. When you go, you take your culture with you. Maybe not trying to take your government, maybe not trying to take that with you, but you take your culture with you. You take what's around you, that goes with you. This is at Zuni Pueblo. This is a picture of kids at Zuni Pueblo. Their ancestors had been here, remember I said 10,000 years? Their ancestors had been 10,000 years. They had been Americans, or they had been on this continent. In the this is actually in the 1920s. In the 1920s, when this picture was made, there were friars and others there who were determined to make them Americans for the first time. So you have these Native American kids dressed as Betsy Ross, dressed as George Washington, dressed all of that kind of thing. They're going to do that. They're going to make Americans as well as Christians out of them. That That it was part of what they carried along with them. It was just almost all but inevitable that went with them. And here is the supreme example of that in a cartoon. This is from the humor magazine Punch. It's about 1900, 1902. But I want you to see, this is Uncle Sam's schoolroom. This is right after the Spanish-American War. And at that time, right after the Spanish-American War, the United States had taken on new territory. The Philippines, Hawaii, which had been absorbed a little bit before the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico, which is nicely misspelled here, and Cuba. These had all been conquered territories during the Spanish-American War. And so Uncle Sam is going to teach them, and they're the unruly students who have to be on the front row so that Uncle Sam can take care of them. At the same time, you see Texas and California, you see the nice students, the good students who are already part of the US. They're sitting and learning. The Chinese have been excluded. In the 1880s, the US government excluded Chinese from immigrating. They're kept out. The Native Americans have been reconciled to the corner. And those poor Native Americans, they're inside, they're here, but look at this. Their book is upside down, saying what they will about the intellectual ability of Native Americans. African Americans can't learn at all in this cartoon. They are relegated to washing the windows, to doing that kind of work. And the sign up here says, and I've got it, believe me, that took a lot of work to transcribe. The chalkboard has written on it, the consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, England or she has greatly advanced the world's civilization, because obviously real civilization is English. Like, being of English descent, I know that for sure. So she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The US must keep its new territories with or without their consent until they can govern themselves. And on the wall up above is written, the Confederate States refused their consent to be governed, so the Union was preserved without their consent. So that's the argument that's being made in the cartoon, and it was one of the political thoughts of the time. One is that if they rebel, it's no different from the Confederates rebelling in the Civil War. That the U.S. has to take action and has to keep them under our thumb, really, is what it's saying. So that's what's being said. So this is the culture in which the Friars, this is the culture in which the church was living the turn of the 20th century here in the United States. Yes?
But isn't Punch a British magazine?
It is.
So this is the British point.
British point of view of, yes. Yeah, it's a British version of what the U.S. is doing. But it was the arguments were being made. These are exactly the arguments that were being made. They're being taken to a bit of absurdity here because it's the British who are doing it. But these are the arguments that were being made. And it's part of, it was part of the thought. So all of this is going on at that time. And that culture is just part of the background of everything that's going to happen with missions and missionaries, Franciscan missions and missionaries too. To go back to Zuni that I was talking about, I was saying this was in 1920, and at the same time, they went to Laguna. The Franciscan missions have never been perfect, but they've often been good. So here, again, this is another, not taking into account the native culture and the native instruments and everything, but bringing a new culture. This is an incredible example of trying to listen so that you can be heard in this one picture. These are both photographs that appeared in the Indian Sentinel, which was a magazine put out by the Catholic Bureau of Indian Missions. It was a money-raising effort. And the way it worked, according to a friar that I talked with who wrote an article for it in the 1950s, the way it worked was if you wanted money from the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, you had to send in writings or articles and pictures for the magazine. The magazine then got distributed to Catholics all over the United States who were asked to donate money. And they did donate money, and then the Bureau helped the missions with the money. This is from Laguna and Acoma. The Acoma and Laguna are side-by-side pueblos, which have always had one mission office between them. So this is in Acoma. Acoma catechists, Francis Berry, or Rejate, gathering, and Dolores Garcia, or I can't pronounce all the names, but anyway, her Native American name and the translation of her Native American name. Governor Bautista Pino and his name, which meant rain. Father Agnella Slammert, Dudach, priest, his Native American title in the place. Then catechist Andrea Serino and Pauline Aragon here on this side of her. This is the day that the catechists were being commissioned. You know, Jim, do you still have a catechetical Sunday in the fall where you commission the catechists to teach?
Yeah, there's a catechetical Sunday. We don't have a lot of catechists, but we do have catechetical Sunday.
Yeah, so this is that Sunday. They were taking a picture, but this is, I mean, the amazing thing is that it wasn't outsiders who were going to share the faith with the children. It was the native catechists. It was that was the transmission, that was going to be the mode of transmission. And it was going to be in the language of the lullaby so that it would be the language of the heart, so that it would be the language of prayer. You know, these native women were the catechists. They were to be the catechists. At Zuni, they never had native teachers. They never had any school sisters at Notre Dame. They were Mishawaka Franciscans. But anyway, they had sisters from outside. It was never done from inside. It always was bringing it in. And so it was a very different, and the amazing thing is, these were both being done by friars at the same time. I mean, as I say, we're not perfect. The Franciscans have never been perfect, but occasionally we've been good. And so here, Agnella Slammert is commissioning these. They're going to go into the villages, they're going to teach the kids, and they're going to see, the kids are going to see, this is our religion. It's not an outsider's religion. And so this is amazing, amazing bit of enculturation that's going on right here. So this is happening to some extent, but it's in the background, you know, what you saw in the background there of racism, of all kinds of different things that were going on that were in the background and in the culture. So occasionally, though, we rose above that. Why was the U.S., again, other things about the U.S. having such a sense of triumph? Well, part of it is that the Western expansion, the manifest destiny, if you will, did not end. You know, manifest destiny, it said in the early 19th century that the U.S., it was the manifest destiny of the United States to go all the way across the continent. You know, from the time of the Louisiana Purchase and Thomas Jefferson sending Lewis and Clark from St. Louis all the way to the Pacific, not stopping at the top of the Rocky Mountains, which is what had actually been purchased from as Louisiana, but to go all the way. So that manifest destiny, it did not end when we got there. There was a sense of we will keep going. So you can see the dates here. The Hawaiian Islands become part of the United States in 1898. Midway had been 1867 when they had made an agreement so that U.S. ships could go to China, to the ports in China. They could resupply. Johnston Island, American Samoa, Wake Island, Guam, all of these things, and then the Philippines are going to come with the Spanish-American War. So that whole sense of continuing and that new frontier continuing to go. The U.S. was a restless nation. It was an energetic young nation that was going to go and do this. So we get to the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, and when we do, we liberated the Philippines. That's the way we presented it. We were liberating the Philippines from Spanish colonial rule. But the Filipinos didn't want us any more than they wanted the Spanish. And so we fought for something like 14 years to subdue the Filipino liberation fronts. The Filipino, and something like 200,000 civilians died. Now, many of them was starvation, many of them was disease, many of them were different things. It was not all in violence, but it was all violently inflicted change in their culture and in their economy that brought it about. But it was, and at the same time, back in the day when the 1820s, when Mexico got its independence and threw the Spanish Franciscans out of what is now Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, and California, the U.S. threw Spanish Franciscans out of the Philippines. We did the same thing. It's amazing how the politics gets caught up and faith and religion get caught up, and how we are still called to move beyond politics. We are always called to move beyond that to get to what's really important, which is going to be about faith and each other and taking care of each other and all of those things that the Franciscans want to and try to do. But as I mentioned, and to go back again, about at the same time, the U.S. is something of a hope. It's something of a new birth for Franciscanism. So the first American Minister General of the Franciscans wasn't Michael Perry. It wasn't even John Vaughan, who was elected in 1979 to be ordained. It was Dominic Reuter in 1904, who was a conventual friar who had been born in Germany, come to the U.S. when he was 3, had lived here, grown up here. He was thoroughly American, and he goes back and he's elected Minister General of the conventual Franciscans. Now, granted, remember, that's the smallest group, but they trace back to Francis. They're part of the Franciscan heritage. So we have this sense of America is special and America is hope. That's why the immigrants were coming. I mean, whether they're Irish or German or Italian, America is hope. It is the land of opportunity. It's the place where they're coming. And Europe is old, and Europe has got problems. And those problems then erupt shortly after this in a huge way. We have the Great War, which begins in 1914. with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. But look what happens. This truly becomes the first ever world war, because global empires are fighting, whether it's the German and the French and the English and the Italians. They all have colonies. They all have dominions. They all have people that they draw upon, so that it becomes this incredible world war that is fought in horrific ways. I mean, they will spend months fighting in trenches in Europe, with me being in one trench and Ralph being in the other, no further away than that. And we're firing rifles at each other for months. And so it's just the accident of who gets killed when, who gets killed when. Just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So that's why you end up, with 12 million Russians in the army, 1,700,000 killed in action, 9 million total casualties. That's civilians and military injured and killed. That's casualty is both military and civilian, and it's both killed and wounded. So you've got, you see what happens, but you still have total military. You have 10 million people killed in the military in World War I, and 9 million civilians. Now, in all of this, look at where the U.S. is on this death chart, this terrible, terrible death chart. 126,000 killed, which is enormous. It's an enormous number killed, and 364,000 who are casualties, who are wounded. But look at that in comparison to Europe. I mean, all of the rest of these are, with the exception of Turkey, all of the rest of these are European countries. These 10 million, 9 million. The US comes through World War I, for want of a better term, relatively unscathed. We did not, and we were not, our land was never touched by war. Our land was never touched by any of the destruction that just overran Europe through this continental Europe all through this time. So it's going to give people an increased sense of that speciality, that exceptionalism of the United States. And people are going to be called upon. How do we get our people when the guns are not on our shore? How are we going to get our people to participate, to get behind the war? Well, this is the first time ever there is a huge propaganda effort with World War I. And it begins with, our boys need socks, knit your bit. That's help. The American Red Cross, this is help. But as it goes on, it gets more and more intense. Beat Germany, support every flag. And this, of course, part of this is because there were many, many, many Irish who were Ireland was trying to get its freedom from England at this time. And so why should the Irish, even in the United States, why should they be supporting the English? That's going on. So, but the British flag is the one right next to the US flag. So support everybody who opposes Prussianism. They didn't even call it German, it was Prussianism. And it gets more and more, more and more vicious. The Huns mark is the bloody hand until it finally gets to this. That the culture of Germany is, this guerrilla is wearing the military hat of the Prussian army. He's got the Kaiser's mustache, and he's just raped Belgium. So this is, and he wants to come here. He wants to bring his culture, his culture here. So this effort goes into creating this whole sense of the U.S. being someplace that has to be kept pure, it has to be kept, all of these things have to happen. And it changes a whole lot of things for Franciscans, especially German Franciscans who are now in St. Louis, and German Franciscans who are now in Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, Bremenstrasse became Liberty Street. You know, and they'd always been gymnasiums, or gymnasium was the German name for high school, and that's what all of the German high schools were called, but they suddenly became minor seminaries or became high schools. You know, German was out. Look at this, between 1885 and 1895, these two provinces had 291 novices, 192 of whom were born across the water, most of them in Germany, and 99 in the US. So it's like 34%, and it's 2/3 and a third. But look, right after the war, or during the war and afterwards, 1915 to 1925, almost the same number of novices, 277, which is pretty amazing if you realize a war is going on, and they still got that many. But look what happens, 237 born in the US, and only 40 born elsewhere, again, almost all Germany. So it goes to an 85-15 split there. And so it's a time of incredible stress and strain on a sense of nationality, a sense of who we are. This is when we become Americans exclusively. This is when we become Americans exclusively and no longer have a sense of ourselves as purely as immigrants who are now here. And one of the examples of this, one of the great examples of this, is Albert Dager, who was a Franciscan friar from Cincinnati, who was the grandson of German immigrants, who had grown up, with German in his household, had grown up with German classes in German in the minor seminary and in college. And now he's a missionary in Santa Fe, or in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. And as a missionary in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, much to his surprise, he is named Archbishop of Santa Fe. In 1919, the armistice has come, but the Versailles has not yet come. The treaty has not yet come. It's an armistice. The war is not officially over. We are at war with Germany. And one more thing to remember is that, or note, is that most of the priests in New Mexico had followed Jean-Baptiste Lamy and his 4 French successors. Most of the diocesan priests of New Mexico were French. And suddenly this German is named their archbishop. They tried to get him removed. They made desperate efforts to get him removed. It didn't quite work. And but there he is. And so this is going to be a struggle for the entire 13 years that he's archbishop. And so we got the story of Albert Dager. But this is only part. This gets us into the 1920s. So it's the post-war era, a little bit, post-World War I. But there's lots of reaction going on. There's lots and lots of reaction going on to World War I and then to the 1920s. It becomes the Roaring 20s, indeed. And so you've got, both on a theological front and on a sociological front and on a political front, you've got all kinds of things going on that are going to be reacted to. In theological background, this is the time when higher criticism of the scripture began. And so in this higher criticism of the scripture, you've got that you can't have just biblical inerrancy, literal inerrancy anymore. You've got to think about, where did the stories come from? You've got to put them together. You've got to try to dig deep into the scripture stories instead of just taking it on the surface in the literal. You've got to, the social gospels in the late 19th century, the Protestant churches had discovered faith in action. They discovered what, that whole Catholic thing of, like we have with the St. Vincent de Paul Society, like we have with Catholic Charity, like we have with all of those things. Protestants discovered that for the first time in the 1890s, and some of them didn't like it. Some of them didn't like it. They said, it should be God and me. You know, it should be all about this. And so there's that reaction, the biblical inerrancy, God and me, that personal salvation, that's a fundamentalist reaction. And so is in the social background, this is all the disquiet after the war. Population shift. 1920 is the first time that the American population is half urban and suburban and half rural. Prior to that, it had been more rural, that's a hard word for me to say. It had been more rural than urban and suburban. But in 1920, it split down the middle. It was split down the middle. And people grew concerned. Rampant materialism. It was the time of the bulging stock market and the Industrial Revolution and cars and Henry Ford and all of this is going on in the 1920s and the roaring 20s. It's uncertainty in the midst of chaos, which leads to fundamentalism. No matter what situation you're talking about, fundamentalism is always, it's seeking to grasp for certainty and security by holding on to a part of something rather than the whole. And so some things happen that you would probably never expect were going on 100 years ago. This is Washington, D.C., and that's the Ku Klux Klan. Marching openly, marching to take back America. And the Ku Klux Klan, this is a cartoon of who the KKK was trying to take America back from. Catholics and Jews. They were seen together, that the Jews were movies and fashions and out for money and all these things. Catholics were out for world domination, and they wanted separate schools, and they were doing all those things. So this is this huge, huge effort to take back America. I mean, we are not living in things that have not happened before. We're not living in times that have not been upon us before. So the restrictions, and so we're going to immigrate, we're going to restrict immigration. We're going to make the U.S. look like us, or at least who we think we are. So in 1921 is the first general immigration restriction in the United States. First time ever that it's a general immigration restriction. We're going to say only so many people can come. And because the 1920 census wasn't available, the results weren't available in 1921, they said we'll go back to the 1910 census and we'll see what the population was in 1910, who we are, what we look like, and that's what we will allow in. Never realizing that everybody from Southern Europe and Italy had come between 1890 and 1910. That had been the explosion of Italian immigration. That had been the explosion of Southern European immigration. And so, boom, they have to go back to 1890. So in 1924, the law gets amended to go back to the 1890 census instead of the 1910. And that immigration then is going to be restricted. We're only going to let in, 3% or less of the population is going to be immigrants at this point. And Uncle Sam is going to make sure that only the good ones get in. That's, that anti-immigrant feeling is going to be there. And so this, again, this is part of what's going on, but still, there's still an effort. There's still the Franciscans, and not just Franciscan men, but all kinds of Franciscans work with a counter story, if you will, with a different story. In 1917, secular Franciscans met called tertiaries at the time, met to organize themselves across provincial lines and across to connect with each other all around. And so 1917 is that first step with a Sacred Heart Province gathering of secular Franciscans. And in 1921, the first quinquennial Congress. How many secular Franciscans? I know we've got some secular. 1, 2, 3, yeah, 4. We've got some secular Franciscans here. 1921, the first quinquennial Congress, the first every 5 years. And look what happened there. This is in Chicago. 2,900 tertiaries gather in Chicago in 1921. There are 75,000 tertiary Franciscans in the United States in 1921. It's amazing. This is again countering all of these things. The national organization, and then quinquennial congresses. I think every year since every 5 years since 1921, except last year they couldn't do it. So the 21 is this last year, so it's going to be in 2022 thanks to COVID. But this is all part of an effort to look at things differently from some of this prevailing culture. And that's going to become especially important as the 1920s come to an end and we get the Great Depression. When the Great Depression comes, the bonus army, this was veterans of World War I, who had been promised that they would receive a monetary reward in, I think it was 1940, or it was 25 years after the service, I think, ended. So that's when they'd been promised they were going to get a for their service 25 years before. Well, by 1930, the conditions are so bad that or 1932, excuse me, they march on Washington, say, give it to us now. Don't wait another 10 years. Give it to us now. Herbert Hoover sent the army to rouse them and get them out of there. That was the reaction. Meanwhile, at the same time, Franciscans are doing what they can do, where they can do it, as they can do it. In Detroit, you've got Solanus Casey, who is up for, he's up for canonization as a saint, founding a soup kitchen, or actually he didn't found it, but he certainly made it big in Detroit. And in New York City, this is the bread line that started the sandwich line on 31st Street in New York City. The soup kitchen in Detroit, the bread line in New York City. In some ways, sad to say, they've happened and been opened every day since the Great Depression to provide direct service, to provide meals, to provide food, to provide what they could to people. And so, that's 90 years that they've been trying to help. Here is also this whole business of a different sense of what it means to be Catholic, what it means to be Christian, what it means to be Franciscan. Bede Hess was Minister General of the Conventual Franciscans, but prior to going to Rome and becoming Minister General, he had been very active with the secular Franciscans. So he was invited back to speak to the 1936 Quinquennial Congress. And at that, this is just the most amazing statement. This is the things that he said, because we've got, in Europe, communism and Nazism are saying we've got the answer. A totalitarian government is the only way. And there was big questions. Should the United States go with a different form of government than democracy? And so here's what he said. Are God's rights above those of the state, or is the state supreme? Is there such a justifiable thing as a totalitarian state? One of the chief tasks of Catholics and tertiaries in the face of communism is to get rid of the notion, both in themselves and in others, that Christianity is not concerned with material and temporal well-being. To deny or neglect the importance, the religious importance of food and clothing and shelter and lovemaking. Remember, secular Franciscans can get married. And lovemaking and recreation is to cast creation back into the face of the Creator. It is to deny the resurrection of Christ's body and ours. The working man has a right to a living wage. Capitalist proprietors, employers, and masters must remember that wealth is a sacred trust. Man and woman should not consider his outward possessions as his own, but as common to all, so as to share them without difficulty when others are in need. When necessity has been supplied and one's position fairly considered, it is a duty to give to the indigent out of that which is over. A duty. So it's this call to community, this call to fraternity. And I mean, this is what Pope Francis is saying in Fratelli Tutti. This is what Pope Francis is saying in Laudato Si. We were just a little bit ahead of him, but he was a Jesuit. It took him a while to learn. Anyway, so that's where we are. And that's where we have to be. We have to be about that. If we are going to be influenced by Francis of Assisi and that whole Franciscan heritage, then these are the things that we also need to take into our hearts. And boom, what happens to bring us out of the Great Depression? Government spending. It's the wrong kind of government spending. It's war. But that's what brought us out of the Great Depression. That's what brought us out of all that unemployment. When you have 12.5% of the population drafted and serving in the army. If you took that today, we would have an army of 41 million people in the United States, as opposed to the 1.4 million that we actually have in the armed services. And so that 56 million in the labor force, which was the largest it had ever been, and 29% of them were women, which has now progressed to 50%. That's one of those things that has changed tremendously. We're going to see part next week of why that changed. But that's it. But this is World War II, which is it's full of a good thing to fight evil. But evil can sneak in unexpected places. There are those who say that that Maximilian Kolbe is the extreme example of the good, which he was, giving his life for others. And there are others who would say that the dropping of the bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the extreme example of evil. How many innocents died there, including Nagasaki being the single place with the greatest Christian population in Japan. It was the single place with the greatest concentration of Christians. And so Nagasaki happens. But, the argument was made, and it's a fair argument, that if we had to invade all of the Japanese home islands, but is that death, that involuntary death for the sake of others, in any way equivalent to Kolbe's voluntary death to save others? Those are questions that we need to ponder. Those are questions we need to think about. So World War II, there were more than 3,000 Catholic chaplains. That's it's like 8% or something or another of all the priests in the United States, including 150 Franciscans, served in the military. Thousands of Japanese, though, were interred for nothing but being Japanese on the West Coast. And servicemen and zoot suiters clashed daily in the spring of 1943. These are the servicemen. This is a zoot suiter who has been confronted by a zoot suiter. Can you see Angelico's outfit here? The gaucho outfit. Think of the Argentinian gaucho and all that. It's lots of fabric. It's lots of fabric, like long coats and baggy trousers and all of those things. That's what a zoot suit was. It was the long jacket and the baggy trousers and the puffy sleeves and things like that. Well, quote, that's a waste of fabric. That's a waste of fabric that could be used for uniforms. But it was also a racism. So this is one Hispanic American being confronted by the mob. This is another. This is Angelico Chavez, a friar from New Mexico, a seventh-generation American in New Mexico. And this is Lieutenant Angelico Chavez in the Navy as a chaplain. And you know, these same people, these are his people. This is their, you know, that connection. We can't really fathom how contradictory we can be at times. So this is going on. But the U.S. comes through World War II. It's a time of triumph. It's a time of triumph and greatness. And so in 1947, part of the celebration is the 6th Quinquennial Congress is held in Cincinnati. And look at the map and the representation of where Franciscans have been as missionaries all around the world. That's going to be a big, big thing. The golden, expansive Catholic 1950s actually go from 1945 into the mid-1960s. It's a very long decade. And here is what I see as kind of an example of that whole thing in one illustration. Part of this 1950s is that it's a time of wanting to be something, you know, wanting to be a part of something bigger. World War II had been a marvelously successful effort at bringing people together. Everybody wanted to be part of something bigger. In the same way, everybody wanted to be part of something life-affirming instead of death-dealing. And so we're going to see an expansion of religious life. We're going to see Catholics being born at an incredible rate during the 1950s. It's about life, it's about living, it's about that hope. And then finally, the heroes who've gone before us. These have been people who sacrificed themselves. Remember, the equivalent would have been 41 million people in the armed forces in that day and our day. So everybody had an uncle, everybody had a brother, everybody had a cousin, everybody knew somebody who had sacrificed their life in World War II, basically, in the United States. There used to be a custom among Franciscans that the family of a friar who was ordained a priest would give that newly ordained a chalice. And quite often on the chalice, the mother would see that the stones in her engagement ring or wedding ring, whatever stones she had, the most precious ones, would be put on the base of the chalice. The idea being that the family would be there with the friar every time he celebrated the Eucharist. Well, this chalice is of Larry Schreiber, one of our friars who was ordained in 1960, right in the midst of this expansive 1950s. His older brother had been killed in World War II. And his mother said, I want the Purple Heart that I got when my son was killed to be there on that chalice so that he will be there. We will be there, Larry, every time you celebrate the Eucharist. And so this is incredible, and it's also, it's just all kinds of symbol there of what that era was like, of, that struggle between, are we a mission to the culture, are we a mission from the culture? What are we all about? What are we all about? And so some of that struggle even is in the popular world. We had a bestseller, Thomas Merton and The 7-Story Mountain, his autobiography. We were, it was big. Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain was never declared a bestseller by the New York Times because they didn't include religious books in the bestseller list in those days. It was not proper. But 7-Story Mountain has never been out of print in almost, 70 years. It has been in print. So that's a bestseller, something that's been in print that long. And the culture, Catholicism was on television. It was on television. Fulton Sheen, they used to claim that in St. Louis and other metropolitan areas, you could walk through Catholic neighborhoods in the summer when Fulton Sheen was on TV and never miss a word that he said because all the windows were open and all the TVs were tuned to it. You know, he was one of the most popular, he's the cover of TV Guide, my goodness, he had to be popular. So he's big. And of course, Senator McCarthy was also big in the anti-communism, and what Catholicism meant to be anti-Catholic, and communism meant being anti-Catholic, Catholic meant being anti-communist. That kind of connection. All through the 50s on TV, we have the arrival of Superman, who's fighting for the never-ending battle for truth, justice, and the American way. He is the ultimate immigrant made good. You know, if you think about all of those immigrant Catholics for the last 100 years coming, he is the ultimate immigrant who made good. You know, and so we have made good. We have arrived. We have arrived by this golden era of the 1950s. And it's important that we do, and it's important that we continue to struggle, because evil is still out there, and evil is red. China. Red China. This is, you know, in 1881, the Friars went back as missionaries to China, following in the footsteps of much earlier. And 3 of the first Franciscans to go as missionaries in the 1880s to China were men of Sacred Heart Province. How do you say it? The Erte brothers?
Yeah. That's good.
Anyway, those 3 brothers. Those 3 brothers who were blood brothers. Anyway, so they're among the first ministers or ones to China. But this is not pictures of them. These are pictures that I love this picture of. This is the Chinese missionaries, and look how they're dressed. Culture and language that they had learned, and living, and you know, if you wish to be heard, first you must listen. They had listened. And so this is Benedict Jensen, who was, actually he was a Danish immigrant to the United States who became a member of St. Barbara Province, who was sent to China as a missionary, or went to China as a missionary, but he was Danish instead of American in his citizenship. So he got to be left out of the prison camp when the Chinese communists first took over that area. And so he did all kinds of things until they discovered he was a Franciscan and killed him. This is Emmanuel Musingan. This one here, with his big beard, his Chinese beard. This is what he looked like as a handsome young seminarian. And then this is what he looked like when I had the privilege of meeting him, the last living American Franciscan Chinese missionary. He died just about 20 years ago. But I had the privilege of meeting him. So here they are, these Western missionaries in China. And China, they were in the Wuhan province. They were in Wuhan.
Yes.
And so there they were, but then in 1949, they're kicked out because China went red. So what did they do as missionaries? Most of them, or many of them, went to the Philippines. That became the next big stopping point. Back to the Philippines. So we have 51 Italian Franciscans expelled from China, open a mission in the Philippines. 52, 56 American Franciscans go there. 62 more the Americans found a seminary there, and the native vocations, et cetera, et cetera. It is this huge and successful mission effort that goes on in the 50s, because that mission still has to go on. And so it is a time, it's a moment of triumph by the end of the 1950s, with all of these things going on. But things are going to change. And so there is the cliffhanger. What's it going to be next? What is going to happen? So that we're at a moment of triumph. We're at a moment of triumph in the 1950s. Then what's going to happen? How did we get today to where we are today, and how do we move forward from here? Next week.
That's great.
All right. Any questions? Any questions? Any other my mistakes or heresies that you caught?
I don't know anything about heresies from the States, that's for sure. But my father was born in Ireland in 1989, and my mother was born in the United States in 1902. They got married. My father came over here, left Ireland, went to Boston, where he had a sister whose husband dealt in the Oriental work business. Well, from there, my father, went from different things. We ended up out to Boston. But the one thing I wanted to say was, I can't believe how my mother and father went, I just get goosebumps, because they lived through a lot of things. And my brother was in World War II, two of his destroyers were blown up. And I don't know, the repercussions on his family because of what he dealt with. And on my family, and what I'm trying to explain is that I think it's amazing. I remember as a child living through World War II and the bread line and the eggs and the milk and all that. And so many of my friends and myself said, what are we going to do? I know that we just have to follow God and what He's teaching us every day, what we need to do ourselves. And that's what I see here. I mean, these people all overcame all this stuff, like, we don't know what to do about this, that, and the other thing, and it's just amazing to see what they went through. And to know my mother and father went through all this. Yeah, but every day, my childhood was, my mother cooked, and, I mean, everything. I mean,
Dad went to work.
yeah, and they just kept going. So I think that's the message. They kept going to church. My mother worked for the priests, and for a little while, and it's just amazing that they lived through all this. And
It
just
is
kept
amazing.
going.
We keep going. Yep. So to hear these voices, to hear the voices of, you hear the voices, you can hear the voices in your memory
Yeah.
of people, but to hear these voices and have them
Yes.
pointed out to us.
Of what was going on when
What
they
was
were
going
taking care of me. I was a late in life, very late in life baby for them. And so they were very, very dedicated, but it's hard to believe that it's such a lesson to learn that we just have to do what we have to do, like you said. They did what they had to do and they went on.
Among Francis of Assisi's last words were, I have done what was mine to do. May
Right.
God show you what you were to do.
Well, it's so hard to know sometimes.
Other questions, other comments?
Yeah, I want to make a remark on, you keep referring as, Lewis and Clark started in St. Louis. Well, they didn't.
They started in Louisville.
Well, actually, they started in Pittsburgh. They dropped boat in Pittsburgh at the mouth of the Ohio. That's where they put their boat in. So they're starting to make changes on that. They're letting the public know that Pittsburgh is recognized as.
Yeah, you can't say that in St. Louis, though.
Because the boat was made. They passed through here. They passed through here, yeah. But they actually started it.
This is where they entered Louisiana, so to speak. This is where they entered the Louisiana
Right.
purchase.
Right.
One of them is buried here in, I think, Calvary Cemetery. I forget.
Meriwether, probably Meriwether Lewis or William Clark.
I can look it up when we get home.
Yeah, and that area down in Mexico that you're, in Mexico, you keep saying New Mexico, that was Mexico. Mexico
Oh,
owned
yeah.
that area.
Oh, yes. But it was called New Mexico even then. It was called New Mexico from the 1570s.
Oh, 1570s, that's when the
It was
Spanish were in there
because
with the missions.
when the Spanish first opened the missions, they
Spanish
said,
mission.
this could be a new,
Conquistadores.
yeah, they said this could be a New Mexico, and that name stuck. It was, because Mexico was, Tenochtitlan, it was what we call Mexico City now, the Valle de Mexico. And so they said this could be a New Mexico, and so literally it was called New Mexico from the 1570s.
Yeah, and this